Today, let's dig into regime change. We've got the author of a recent report, a policy analysis for Cato, on the historical record, the empirical record of regime change, something that's very relevant given current U.S. policy in Venezuela and Iran. So our guest tonight is Benjamin Denison. He is a postdoctoral fellow at Tufts University at the Center for Strategic Studies at the Fletcher School there. Previously, he was a U.S. Foreign Policy and International Security Fellow at Dartmouth College's Dickey Center for International Understanding. His current research looks both at the local determinants of military occupation strategy and the long-term effects of American regime change operations. He received his PhD in political science from the University of Notre Dame. So, Ben, just to start off, what precisely do and don't you mean by the term regime change?
Well, first, thank you, John, for inviting me to come to speak with the Society again. And it's always great to discuss regime change. When we talk about regime change, it can actually mean a lot of different things, different ways that scholars have used the term throughout different academic arguments. Most often when I talk about regime change, I usually define it as the use or threat of the use of military force to impose new domestic political leaders or new domestic political institutions on a foreign country. However, you could definitely think of regime change on kind of a continuum, going all the way from interfering in foreign elections up to full-scale occupation of a foreign territory and kind of covert operations with the CIA and things like that in between, as well as what we normally think of as kind of a small-scale military intervention. It's kind of maybe the most common type of regime change that we think of when we use the term.
All right. And so now that we've got the terms defined, what is the empirical record of regime change? Could you sum it up for us as a policy tool?
So in my opinion, the empirical record is that it doesn't work very often. And to really answer the question kind of more in depth, you have to ask, what is the specific goal that you are trying to achieve with the regime change mission? In terms of just the ability for the United States or other countries to impose a new government through military force, the track record of being able to impose the government is pretty good. You're able to, take out one leader and replace it with another leader with a relatively high level of success. The problem then, though, is what was the goal you were trying to achieve by overthrowing that leader or imposing a new regime in the country? And lots of scholars have tried to look at the various different goals that states might have when they try to engage in regime change operations. And pretty much for all the main political goals, the impact of regime change usually makes things worse rather than better. So for instance, some have looked at, you might engage in regime change because you have policy disagreements or you want to have better relations with the foreign government. So you overthrow the government, put a new one in place, hoping they'll agree with you on foreign policy issues. And in fact, it actually makes relationships usually worse rather than making the relationship between states better, which makes sense because the people in the country won't necessarily be happy that you overthrew their government for them. In terms of economic, it could be the case like some people argue in Latin America that the United States will overthrow governments for economic reasons. But research has looked at this and found that usually trade and foreign investment actually gets worse in countries that have had their leaders recently overthrown by the United States or others. And so there's no economic benefits that come from it as well. In security issues, it could be the case that you might want to overthrow a government in order to make a country more stable, more secure, maybe prevent a terrorist safe haven from arriving. But also they found, scholars have found that it actually, foreign regime change makes countries more unstable. It weakens the institutions. And so there's kind of more instability in the country and less security. And finally, the one that most people look at is the level of democracy. So if you're interested in kind of imposing democracy through regime change, pretty much the scholarship has all agreed that, except in a very, very few specific cases, democracy cannot be imposed by gunpoint and be sustainable. In fact, what the research finds is that in political science, we have this idea of kind of what we call middle regimes, where they're not fully authoritarian or not fully democratic. And we find that actually trying to impose democracy kind of pushes things towards the middle. and it just creates more instability in the political system. So depending on whatever type of goal you might have, basically what we find is that regime change very rarely succeeds. And in the cases it does succeed, it's usually for reasons that policymakers are not thinking about.
Yeah, so what about, though, there are some notable success cases. Germany post 1945 had a significantly better government on a lot of those metrics than they did pre 1945, as did Japan. You could also point to Grenada after the invasion in 83, Panama, some of these other states. Is this an exception to the rule? How does this fit into that broader empirical finding?
So there's two different kinds of successes that you pointed out there. The first one is kind of the one that actually I find that, especially in the lead up to the Iraq War in 2003, this was what policymakers were pointing at, the previous experience of the US post-World War II in Germany, in Japan, and also at the same time in South Korea, Austria, and Italy. But the kinds of regime change operations that were undertaken after World War II were very different for a variety of different reasons than the ones that are normally undertaken today. And there's kind of three main arguments about what made them different. The first one is about that's David Edelstein talks about in his book, Occupational Hazards, largely argues that the existential threat from the Soviet Union made it so that the societies in Germany and Japan were willing to let the United States kind of continue to occupy the territory in order to make sure that the Soviet Union wouldn't be able to come in and occupy them as well. They would rather have the regime imposed by the United States than have the regime imposed by the Soviet Union. And so that's a very kind of rare scenario that doesn't exist in most cases. Another important condition that is very rare in regime change discussions today is kind of the pre-existing local institutions and local economic development in these countries. While Japan and Germany were devastated by the war, they kind of had this pre-existing local bureaucratic capital they built up in their previous history. So they actually had kind of a functioning, what we call a strong state or strong state institutions in political science lingo that the United States was able to kind of tap into in order to kind of build a government on top of it very quickly and scale it up relatively fastly. Whereas in other societies where the institutions are weaker, it's much more difficult to be able to kind of build new institutions and be able to get a new government going very quickly. And then the final argument that some people make is that those successes after World War II were largely the result of the US being willing to spend enough money with the Marshall Plan and other types of efforts in order to keep the society running. I'm skeptical of these arguments because, in fact, I think in 2014, if I remember correctly, the U.S. passed in real dollars spending in Afghanistan than they spend in the entire Marshall Plan. So if it was just kind of more effort and more economic resources that would produce success, we should have seen success in Afghanistan already. But those are kind of the three arguments. And I think really the Soviet Union and the pre-existing conditions explain the World War II cases. For Panama, for instance, which was a success case, it is one of the rare cases where conditions kind of lined up and allowed it to be a successful regime change mission. Some important things that people forget, though, about the Panama case when it's brought up in discussions, especially about Venezuela, are some of the unique factors that were there. The U.S. had basically been occupying the Panama Canal Zone at that point. Since basically the development of the Panama Canal, it wasn't turned over fully to the Panamanians yet. And so there was already kind of a military presence in the country. And it was, in effect, it made it much easier for the United States to very quickly kind of undertake the small, light footprint regime change operation that allowed them to kind of take the resources that were already there. But we often forget that there still was a 4 or 5 year democracy promotion military mission in Panama afterwards, after they actually engaged in regime change. So even though it was a success, it actually was a bit longer and cost more resources than folks typically think about when we're using this as a case to justify why we should go into Venezuela or places like that.
Okay, yeah, that's pretty interesting. And so, it seems like if we're trying to do regime change somewhere else, we just need to create a really good external threat to get them to fall in line. So going to the mechanisms in the other direction, why is it that regime change tends to fail? What are the drivers, the structural factors, the reasons that these things seem to go off road so much?
So I think there are two main, there are probably more than two, but there are two factors I like to point to try to explain why these regime change missions often are more likely to find failure than success. The first one is there's a fundamental, what we call principal agent problem that is set up when you try to impose a new government into the territory. So if you're a foreign power and you impose a government in a foreign territory, that newly imposed government has to respond both to the person or the country that imposed them and their local domestic constituents. So what they try to do is so if the United States imposes a government in a foreign country, they're going to have to respond to the US policymakers who installed them and try to achieve whatever policies that the US wanted them to achieve. At the same time, their domestic population is going to be telling them, or their domestic power holders and the domestic elites are going to want their own goodies and their own policies that they want for themselves. And we see this in Afghanistan, where the United States would often get into fights with the installed Afghani rulers because they would actually be trying to produce the policies that the people in Afghanistan wanted for themselves rather than what the United States wanted. And so you get this fundamental principal agent problem where either the newly installed leader is not doing the types of policies that the foreign power or the United States wants them to do. So it fails because they're not actually engaging in the policies we wanted, or they stick too closely to what the United States wants them to do, and the domestic population has incentives to overthrow them. And if we look, Alexander Downs is a political scientist at GW. He's coming out with a new book, I think, in the fall, and he finds that, in fact, when the life expectancy of newly installed leaders by foreign powers is quite low for exactly this reason, because it encourages revolts against them because the population doesn't want to have a leader that responds to a foreign power more than their domestic interests. The second, I think, reason why these regime change missions often fail is that in any time you have a big change in domestic political institutions, we find that the state institutions get weak. And so basically, it takes a lot of time to rebuild these new state institutions and to kind of build up the legitimacy of the new leadership. And during that time, while the institutions are weak, it gives opportunities for civil conflicts to break out, for instability to emerge and rebel groups to emerge because the state is not strong enough to repress them or to keep or providing the goodies that would keep them at bay. And so it's often kind of a race. Can you get a strong state with capable institutions in place before these civil grievances will pop up and a civil war will break out? And more often than not, the institutions can't be built quickly enough, and these rebels end up kind of leading a charge against the newly imposed government.
Reminds me of, I think it's related to your first point about the principal agent problem. Sean Yam out at Temple has a book, From Resilience to Revolution, talking about external support for weak regimes. And basically his argument is it actually makes them, it may shore them up a bit, but it makes them weaker in the long run because it enables them to put off compromises with some of these local sources of dissent, that you're essentially bringing the foreign power that's supporting you into your governing coalition, into your ruling coalition, rather than making the tough choices that, say in a country like Egypt, you're not bringing in the Muslim Brotherhood or some of these other alternative political forces. You're saying, okay, we're going to lean on support from the United States. And that leads to also like a hardening of the state institutions where they begin to rely more on repression, and it ultimately hinders their ability not only to remain in power, but to receive feedback from the public in a way that can allow them to correct their direction. But given all these problems with regime change as a policy choice, that it really doesn't work most of the time, why is it that policymakers keep choosing it? Across a number of different administrations, you had, for instance, the Obama administration might have been the most striking example because they come in in many ways having won the presidency because of the legacy of the Iraq War, and then they end up doing regime change in Libya, not 2 years into their term in office. I'm curious why it keeps being chosen.
So this is kind of a question that a lot of scholars that are working on regime change are trying to answer right now, because it is kind of this persistent puzzle of, now that we have good research that shows these trends, why do policymakers kind of keep doing the same mistakes over and over and over again? I argue in some of my own work that what's happening is there's largely this kind of mindset among policymakers where they're looking for quick and easy policy successes. And they become convinced that instead of trying to negotiate for a long time with a regime we don't like, or it's going to be really hard to get some through sanctions or through another policy to try to get whatever policy we want achieved, why don't we just quickly and easily overthrow the government? We'll got people we like in power, and then we can get whatever concessions that we want that we've been focusing on. And I think there's this kind of persistent myth that you can do regime change very quickly and very easily. And in pretty much none of the cases that I've looked at throughout US history, even in cases where there's like multi-decade long occupations, they never think that it's going to be a long trip or a long, it's kind of the Gilligan's Island problem. They think it's going to be a 3-hour tour, and they end up stranded in this country for a long period because they get there and they realize it's much more complicated than they ever thought. I argue that it's because there's this inherent uncertainty when you're thinking about invading a country. We have really good ability to assess kind of how strong the military is, but we're actually not very good, pretty much no country is, at assessing what will the political institutions look like after we intervene in the country. And that uncertainty allows policymakers to assume that things will go very swimmingly after the intervention. They don't plan very much for the post-war period. And then once they get there, they have this, oh no, things are much more complicated problem. So I think this uncertainty is one reason why we keep having policymakers opting into regime change. Another problem is that there are these very limited number of successes. And so they can be pointed to as, oh, it worked in the past. We just need to work harder. We just need to have the right strategy. We just need to find the right person in charge. When you look at kind of the critiques of the Iraq War, you'll often see kind of the different camps of people saying what went wrong with the Iraq War. They largely come down to, we had the wrong strategy, we didn't spend enough money, or we had the wrong person in charge. Very rarely do they focus on, should this have been done in the first place, or what it's trying to find kind of how to do it better. And I think that looking at kind of over-focusing on the strategy and the resources can lead policymakers to kind of look at these previous successes and say, oh, we could do it if we just did it properly. In fact, I've heard from some folks that when they created kind of this history of U.S. nation building prior to the Iraq War that the Rand Corporation produced, some people have said that the Bush administration only read the first chapter on Germany and then skipped all the other chapters. That allowed them to kind of think that this, it worked well then, we can do it. We can do it again. So I think kind of the uncertainty and looking at the past and being able to point to some cherry pick successes kind of drives a lot of the thinking among policymakers.
That's really interesting. The Gilligan's Island remark reminded me of when Iraq was just starting. Someone I was friends with had said to me, "Don't worry about it. We'll be out in 6 months. No big deal. It's going to be easy." And we're still there 17 years later, pretty much 17 years later. Let's go ahead and get some audience questions. If you click on the participant list at the bottom, you can click the raise hand button and I can call on you if you want to ask a question right over video. You can also plug it into the chat box. And I have a few audience questions that we already had submitted ahead of time that I'm happy to ask. All right, so we've got one over here from Spencer. How do you build up an appetite for pursuing diplomacy and dialogue in the existing foreign policy establishment, particularly with countries the U.S. has had a historically adversarial relationship with? Is the JCPOA a good example of the potential for this as a tool? Is this something that we could replicate?
So I think, in my own opinion, the JCPOA is something that we should be trying to replicate, focusing on kind of, I think what policymakers need to often realize, and we don't do enough of in the US, is we have to recognize that different countries have different interests than the United States, and we're not going to be able to agree on kind of fundamental interests. But we can find ways to make the world kind of more constructive through diplomacy for each party. How to build up that appetite? It's going to be very difficult. I think there's going to have to be kind of refocusing of where does foreign policy actually get made in the US system. Right now, it's kind of too heavily on the Department of Defense. And when you're in the Department of Defense, you have lots of hammers and everything looks like nails. Whereas if you're not spending as much resources on building up the Department of State, there's not going to be as much interest in diplomacy. But I think the first thing that needs to happen is there has to be this embracing of the mindset that there are going to be states that have different interests in the United States, and that's okay. We can find ways to work with them. It used to be the case that we could find ways to make diplomatic negotiations, even with states we disagreed with on fundamental issues. But until we're able to accept that, it's going to be more likely that the Department of Defense and militarized options come to the table instead of diplomatic options.
Yeah, I think a lot in this context, with using diplomacy as a tool for managing these disagreements, as opposed to a way of just imposing our will, coming in with a list of demands and then waiting for the other side to concede them. John F. Kennedy's famous speech at American University that has this famous line. It's talking about the Soviet Union, their different system, and he says, "We cannot now end our differences. We can at least make the world safe for diversity." And that ultimately, is the model that diplomacy tends to be working on in a lot of these cases. That, we really don't like these regimes, but we also recognize that, we live in the world as it is, not the world as we wish it to be. Just to dig in on the Iran case a little bit, one of the audience questions we had submitted ahead of time was, do you think that the current maximum pressure campaign is, in essence, a regime change strategy?
In my opinion, of course, I am not in these meetings at all, so I'm just kind of looking at it like everyone else is through the news. But in my opinion, it is, at least looking kind of the intellectual origins of where the strategy came from, is definitely, the goal is to produce enough pressure on the regime to either force the domestic population to make the regime change its foreign policy. But in effect, it's also kind of hoping for an uprising to overthrow the regime. In which case, the nice thing about the maximum pressure, the only nice thing I can say about it, I guess, is that it's not actually a militarized strike yet. So there hasn't been the propulsion to go in and use military force directly to overthrow the regime, which would make things infinitely worse in the country. But I think it's largely the maximum pressure campaign. Like, we could be using this opportunity during this current pandemic to try to show that, we are not against the Iranian people. We have disagreements on fundamental issues. We could reduce some sanctions and reduce the pressure a bit to show we're not simply caring about overthrowing your regime. But it seems like today, when you read the news, that in fact we're doubling and tripling down on the maximum pressure during the pandemic. And that just gives more signal that it's not really, it's pretty well focused on leveraging this as an opportunity maybe to overthrow the regime. I'm very skeptical kind of this current administration's Iran policy for that reason. I think it would be using diplomacy like the JCPOA from the previous administration is probably the best way to enhance U.S. security.
Just to move across the Gulf a bit, or to straddle the Gulf, Salman from our University of Texas at Dallas chapter asks, how should the U.S. best manage that regional conflict then between the United States and Iran?
So my preference would be to kind of keep the diplomatic channels open, to keep trying to try to find ways to signal to the Iranians that we are concerned about your external behavior, but we are not concerned about your internal characteristics. I think one of the problems with U.S. foreign policy, especially since the end of the Cold War, is we've been sending lots of signals that we are interested in regime change, or interested in kind of the domestic politics of many other countries, not only through forceful regime change using military force, but also sanctions, targeting regimes, different ways of using like the UN and different international organizations, a variety of different tools that the U.S. has tried to target regimes with, including some democracy promotion efforts. And I think if we could find a way to signal to the Iranians that we can come to agreements on nuclear issues, we can come to agreements on kind of maybe the Iraq issue, but we are not interested in kind of the targeting your domestic population or your domestic regime at all, would be the best way to get started with a dialogue on the country. We can't ever expect the Iranians to give up their nuclear program fully if they're worried about a future American strike on the regime. If they're worried that the U.S. might be interested in engaging in regime change in the future, they need to maintain that nuclear deterrent to prevent regime change from happening. They look at the Libya example where Gaddafi had a very small nuclear program that wasn't functional, but he did give it up in 2003 when the U.S. asked. And then in 2011, he found out that he might have liked to have that nuclear program as a deterrent when the U.S. came and engaged in regime change there. So I think I'm not an expert in Iran itself, but I think the best way to kind of start that diplomatic negotiation would be to try to find ways to send signals that we are not interested in your domestic regime and we are only interested in kind of how your foreign policy is playing out.
So I think that ties up well with Ryan's question from the chat box about the volatility of U.S. foreign policy. That each administration seems now to be undermining the policies of the last in some important ways, particularly with regard to Iran. Could say a hypothetical Biden administration credibly commit to not getting entangled in the internal politics of Iran? Given the possibility of a total reversal in 4 years.
So, in my own opinion, if I was like communicating with the Iranian regime, I would say you can't trust the U.S. beyond 4 or 8 year promises at this point, largely for the reasons you just mentioned, that we don't know kind of with the different volatility going from the Bush administration to Obama to the Trump administration. It vacillates back and forth between kind of how they view the region. So it'd be very difficult for me to recommend that they give up the nuclear program, for instance, given these vacillations. It is the case, though, the Biden administration, Biden did have experience with the JCPOA. So there might be an opportunity where he gets some of the same negotiators back and tries to rebuild that relationship. It would take really hard diplomacy, and the U.S. would probably have to give up more than it gave up the first time in order to get them back on board. But I think the biggest thing that the U.S. can do is recognize that these, like the nuclear program is often focused on trying to preserve the regime. The Iranians will look at how the Trump administration has responded to North Koreans versus Iran, and they'll largely see that one of the reasons why they treat North Korea with a little bit better than Iran is because they, now they have a credible nuclear program, and trying to convince Iranian policymakers to not go down that path, I think would be very difficult, regardless of who the next president is.
Another question here from Joe, who asks if it's possible that path dependency is the reason that the U.S. keeps resorting to regime change. And then he has a second question, whether the reason we were so successful in Germany and Japan is that we took the time to get to know their cultures and societies in a way that we didn't with, say, Iraq, or, perhaps maybe to go a little bit further on that, maybe Germany was a more familiar culture to the United States than Iraq was. So
I think, Joe, you said if you could maybe write in the chat what you mean by the path dependency question. I'll answer that after the one on Germany and Japan and the culture argument. For one reason why maybe Germany and Japan, there is an argument that you can make that there are more civil affairs officers in the U.S. military who had experience with German, maybe German immigrants in their family and that nature. But in a lot of my research, what I find is that once, I look extensively at the U.S. occupation of Italy, for instance, and even though they have lots of people with experience and knowledge about Italian culture, they didn't have really strong knowledge about how the Italian tax code worked. And so they had lots of knowledge about okay, here's kind of how Italian unification happened. Here's the Renaissance. Here's how the church and state kind of cooperate together. But then when they really needed to figure out, okay, we want to put a mayor in power to collect taxes to get the money needed to feed these people, they had no knowledge of kind of how those actual institutions worked. And so I think in Germany and Japan, what they were able to find was that they kept a lot of the bureaucrats who had this knowledge of like, how do we actually make, the machines of government work? They kept them as the kind of low-level bureaucrats in power that allowed them to kind of get the governments running up and going quickly. Going back to what we talked about earlier, one of the reasons that the Soviet Union was helpful for this is actually the United States was also afraid of the Soviet Union. So it permitted them in both Japan and Germany to say, we're not going to completely purge everyone who has one like Nazi, party membership card in their background. But instead, if you were a low-level bureaucrat and you know how to collect the taxes, we're going to keep you so we can figure these things out. So if you have that external threat, it can also aid in keeping these people who know how the government works in power. I do think it is important to understand kind of cultural and local knowledge. But what I find in my own research is that knowledge only really comes after you've actually invaded the country itself. And there's this lag time that it takes you to realize kind of, oh, things are much more different than we assumed. And that kind of can lead to this, what I said earlier, the Gilligan's Island problem, where you realize things are much more complicated and the society is much more different than we thought. Just to give another quick example about Germany, the initial US plans assumed that Germans would kind of fight to the last German as the US was invading. And they kind of had this idea called the Morgenthau Plan, where they were going to completely deindustrialize Germany in order to make sure they would never be able to fight a war again. And once Eisenhower and other generals got there, they realized their assumptions of what the German character was completely wrong. And they realized these are, at this point they were defeated and they just kind of wanted to move on, the average German. So kind of once they got that local knowledge, they were able to then change kind of their occupation strategy to allow them to understand what would be most successful for US political goals. And I didn't see if he noted anything about path dependency.
I don't think that came in,
okay.
but that last thing reminded me. I believe I heard once an anecdote about FDR, in the late 30s, talking about German aggression, in a private meeting or something, being driven by the Junkerturm, which was a social institution that, as I understand it, had been destroyed pretty quickly during and after World War I. And so, even the knowledge that we had derived from a previous conflict with the same country was not necessarily current, just a few decades later. But the point there about maybe the limits on denazification and on removal of lower level officials, would you contrast that with DeBaathification in Iraq? I mean, I know that's a hugely controversial topic, but was that part of the problem in Iraq?
So this is kind of a historical debate, and I think we'll never really get to the end of it without full documents becoming declassified. But in my own personal view, I take the view that DeBaathification made things worse, but a lot of the institutions were fundamentally broken beforehand. We hadn't had good U.S. diplomatic reporting in Iraq for a long period. We kind of based our previous assessments of the way Iraqi institutions looked based in the 1980s. And in the 1990s, there were lots of sanctions that were levied against Iraq. Saddam became more and more paranoid, so he started coup-proofing all these institutions in the state. And it eventually led to kind of a less functional and less strong state pre-invasion than we realized, in my opinion. And so once we invaded, it was kind of both the U.S. breaking and also a revelation that it was already kind of a little bit broken itself. It is the case, though, that they did look at denazification and they thought, they were trying to kind of replicate it in some way. But there's a lot of historical debate about who exactly made the decision to do as much DeBaathification as they did. And pretty much if you read every single memoir from the Iraq decision makers, they all point to somebody else. So we'll have to really get into the documents in the future to see kind of who said what and when and who made the final call.
Well, there's that old joke about Washington policymaker memoirs that the subtitle of all of them could be "If only they'd listened to me."
Yes.
So What about the comparative element in regime change? Because the United States has done a lot of regime change, so there's a lot of cases to talk about. But you could say the Soviets, the French, the Athenians. That there are lots of other powers that have used this policy tactic. Is it just that we Americans are somehow uniquely bad at it, or do they have a lot of the same problems that we do?
So I think most countries have the same problems that the United States has. The Soviets, the track record is not much better. Similarly, their post-World War II cases are the ones they had the most success with. They had a real hard time in the 1920s and 30s trying to export, the communist revolution around the world. And I think they succeeded in Mongolia, and that's about it initially in the 1920s and 1930s. But I think what makes the United States unique is that we had the power projection capability to actually go try this in more places around the world than a lot of other countries have. If, for instance, most countries will only be able to try to engage in regime change overtly, at least, in only kind of their limited neighborhood. Whereas if you're able, with the United States having as much military capability as it has, it's able to, if it wants to, try this in many more different countries. But I will say, just to give kind of a comparative lens on this, my favorite case I like to point to found in my dissertation research was the Egyptians at one point wanted to intervene in the Yemeni civil war. They decided to intervene to try to overthrow and support the new government that was being placed in Yemen. But when they got there, they realized they forgot to bring any maps with them. And they ended up kind of staying there for multiple years, only intending to be there for 3 weeks. And so I think that I point that as kind of like a uniquely bad regime change mission often in my research, but not too different from what the United States is doing, just with different levels of resources where there's not much planning beforehand. There's not much knowledge of what's on the ground. And I think it's just the fundamental uncertainty of it's very difficult to understand before you intervene in these countries, kind of all the domestic parameters you're starting to interfere with. It kind of makes all countries not so able to kind of produce the outcomes that they want. I think in the comparative sense, the cases that might have the most success are the French in their former African colonies. They're able to kind of, because is largely after decolonization, they have more links kind of with the newly decolonial governments. They have some success in those cases, but it's kind of that colonial legacy that allows them maybe to be marginally more successful.
And so everybody feel free to jump in with questions. You can put them in the chat box. You can go to the participant list, click your own name and click raise hand, and I'll be able to see it. And you can ask a question over video. But just to kind of stay on this theme of regime change and other powers, what about the argument that our own policy has established a kind of precedent setting? I know Russian officials have made arguments in the past about like a Kosovo precedent, which I guess is not a regime change case, but is this something where we're opening a Pandora's box where, say China or another great power might begin attempting regime change because we did it?
So there's definitely an effect of how China and Russia are viewing U.S. foreign policy since the end of the Cold War as related to regime change. The debate is kind of what outcome that their views of American regime change will actually produce. So it is clear when you look at kind of how they talk even about nuclear missile talks or arms control talks, or how they talk about the UN and Security Council, there's clearly kind of this latent understanding that the U.S. might be interested in using these tools of foreign policy for regime change in the future, potentially even against. I don't think the U.S. is going to try regime change in Russia or China, but policymakers in Russia and China kind of have this sometimes in the back of their mind that, well, if they tried it in these other places, why can't they try it in Moscow and Beijing? And that's caused them to try to weaken different tools and kind of push back against American democracy promotion efforts and things that might weaken their regime. Specifically about China, what some folks have argued that because of U.S. Regime change interests, China might try to kind of re-engineer the global order by trying to make it more focused on sovereignty and try to say, if support our institutions, we're going to Instead of the IMF, if you take loans from us, we're not going to try to impose a certain type of political beliefs on you. You can do whatever you want. So that's kind of one argument that China might try to gain influence by saying we're not going to intervene in your domestic politics, versus oftentimes for like IMF loans, or the US or somebody else will say you have to be making progress on democracy indicators to get different loans. Alternatively, though, I think as you start to see a more aggressive China, and they start to kind of think less about maybe the form of government, but more, are they leaning more towards pro-China or pro-US? I think this could provide an opportunity where they do see as a precedent that if the US is willing to use these institutions to kind of promote more pro-democratic regimes, why can't we use these institutions to kind of try to go after our own interest and get domestic governments that support our interests as well? I think it's a real debate about kind of which way China will go. My guess is in some parts they'll try to be, look, we are not intervening, and in some parts they'll try to say, yes, we are using these tools to try to achieve our own national interests. In Russia's case, I think for sure that they're definitely pointing to U.S. actions and saying, you've done all these things. Oftentimes they even kind of inflate what U.S. capabilities are. So they point to all the color revolutions in the near abroad, where the U.S. really didn't even have any influence in those domestic upturns, but because there was a U.S. funded NGO in the vicinity, they claimed this was a U.S. Regime change mission. And so I argue that this is why the U.S. should not be engaging in armed regime change, because it allows these kind of soft democracy promotion efforts to get grouped together with this armed regime change mission. If we could try to say, no, we are not using armed force or trying to overthrow your regime in any way, you're just supporting, your own domestic NGOs. I think that'd be better, but it's a hard thing to credibly commit that you're not interested in overthrowing the regime when you're funding these types of democracy promotion efforts.
So we've got a pretty good question here again from Salman, tying to human rights issues in some of these countries. What are since regime change doesn't seem to work, and I think you might have talked a bit about human rights and regime change in your paper. Mm-hmm. What are the challenges around that? But then what should we be doing instead in places where, there are things that are clearly out of step with American values, but this kind of preferred mechanism that we've been using for a while of regime change actually doesn't work all that well?
So on human rights specifically, there is some research out there that shows that once you engage in regime change, actually the typical indicators of human rights violations get worse. So there are more government killings, there's more state repression, human rights abuses rise, largely because I talked about earlier, this weak institutions are created in the society. So there's more civil wars and more civil uprising, and that's usually where you see worse human rights outcomes. But if the U.S. is interested in, trying to prevent kind of mass killings or human rights, or trying to help with human rights abuses, I think the best thing the U.S. can do, honestly, is try to make a very strong push to kind of open asylum requests and try to help refugees wherever they're going, and try to use diplomatic tools rather than trying to use force that will only cause, I think, in my opinion, more instability to rise in these countries. It's not a very politically palatable solution at this current moment, but I think trying to find ways to support kind of refugees and different domestic organizations that are working against these human rights abuses are the best tools. And again, trying to find ways to say that we are not super interested in trying to credibly commit that we can support dissidents and folks who are being targeted by the government without saying we're going to target the regime itself is a very difficult problem to try to square. But it's something that we should be trying to do to signal that we want to help preserve our values while also not trying to get us caught in these quagmires that will only make the human rights situation even worse. I think it's a really tough problem. I admit that's kind of the toughest one to square. But I think oftentimes this compulsion to do something can lead us too far astray.
All right. Well, we've got a question now from either Byron or his cat. So go ahead now.
Cool. Hey, Ben, this has been great. Thank you so much for taking time to meet with us. I guess my question relates to what you said a little bit earlier about how regime change is tough, and a lot of administrations have tried to do it again and again with really poor results. Going back to Libya in the Obama administration, Susan Rice, who is someone that I think is like world-renowned, someone that I respect, even had some qualms about Libya, but Libya did happen. In your expertise, is it that the State Department has less power than DOD? You know, DOD is kind of looking for those nails, or does the State Department kind of feel like they'll be able to, I guess, outmaneuver other countries diplomatically, even if things go awry?
So I think for sure right now, the State Department has less power than the Defense Department. And, you know, it's largely been that way since the founding of the Defense Department after World War II, after they consolidated. But on Libya specifically, I think it's a good example of what I think happens oftentimes with interventions and how it leads to these regime change style interventions, where in Libya, and also a lot of the cases that I've looked at from my own research in Latin America pre-World War II, the U.S. will intervene in some kind of civil conflict without really fully realizing kind of what's driving that conflict, or they have a local partner who is trying to, who's talking with them about, here, you should support my side, you should support our side in this civil conflict. And once the U.S. arrives, they realize that things are much more complicated, and they end up engaging in regime change. When they first authorized the intervention, they never intended that they were going to do so. So in Libya, for instance, when the U.S. went to the Security Council, they at least argued that they weren't going to go for full regime change. And that's why Russia and China did not veto the Security Council resolution. But pretty much as soon as it started and they realized kind of where things were going, it was almost like, oh, we have an opportunity to do it. Things are going well right now, so why not just keep going? I think that's what often happens in these cases. So for instance, in 1916, the U.S. went to kind of help reinstall or intervene in the small civil conflict in the Dominican Republic. And they end up occupying the country for 8 years, because once they arrived there, they realized that pretty much no matter who we put in power, the country is not going to be able to be stable and we'll have to come back again. So this is kind of a similar type policy, I think, happens over and over again, where I don't think it's always the case where the initial policy is, we're going to go overthrow this regime. It's, we're going to go intervene. And once they get there, they realize, oh, it's just an easy kind of to keep going. And that's kind of almost why I think in my own, you have to resist this urge to intervene in some cases, because you don't know how far you're going to end up going once you start the intervention.
So, Joe, we've got a question from you, maybe a follow-up on the path dependency point.
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Ben, for being here today. So when I think about path dependency, I think about maybe the same way a gambler acts. So they had these small success. They had these initial successes with Germany and Japan, and from that point onwards, they just think like, okay, if we use this often enough with other countries, it will hopefully work both in the short term and the long term. Does that sound like a plausible assertion, or am I maybe being a little bit too reductivist?
Well, thank you for the question, and also a great background, Forza Italia. So we will, I think the biggest, with the question, I do think there is this kind of trend where it worked in the past, we can try it again and keep going. But it's also odd because there are different breaks then in between there where things go badly. So like right after World War II, while they're having success, they have a spectacular failure in trying to orchestrate regime change in Albania. This is kind of a great story. If you read, Lindsay O'Rourke just published a great book on covert regime change. And in there, she has the story of how the US tried to overthrow the Albanian regime by setting up dissident radio stations to play every day from 4 to 6 p.m. But the communist power company in Albania didn't actually turn on power until 8 p.m. So there was no time for anybody to listen to it. So, but that's the point being, is that at the same time there are these successes, there are also these failures going on as well. And I do think there is policymakers' selective memory of, if this has worked in the past, we can keep going. And I think even in specific administrations, if it worked in the beginning. So for instance, with the Bush administration, the initial view was that Afghanistan was a rousing success. We quickly overthrew the Taliban government. We got Al-Qaeda out. We got it relatively stable, and we were able to leave. And that was seen as, okay, that's successful. So let's go do it again in Iraq. So I think there is kind of that kind of path dependency. Similarly, in the Obama administration after Libya, Obama was not going to intervene and engage in regime change in Syria. He had a famous, interview, I think with The Atlantic, but I might be wrong about that, where he said, in the future, now I always ask, what comes the day after? And if you can't answer that, I'm not going to intervene. So I think there is something to that. But another type of path dependency I think I see in going back is if there's repeated crises with the country, eventually the US might think, okay, we've tried to resolve this crisis in multiple different ways. Now I'm just going to now that I have the opportunity to overthrow the government, I'm going to go for it. And I think that's one type of path dependency that also exists that can backfire pretty heavily.
You mentioned a few times, support from exile groups as a potential assist in some of these regime change efforts, and I'm curious what the effect there is. Because there's famous cases of failure, like Ahmed Chalabi in Iraq, and also like some of the exile intelligence sources, Curveball, being the most famous example, that were feeding bad information. Is it a help or hurt thing? I know Machiavelli also had a famous line about exiles being extremely dangerous because they'll tell you anything in order to get your assistance.
So I'll plug here also, Melissa Willard Foster just had a great book that came out exactly on this topic. What she finds is that these exile groups or dissidents have incentive, or even just groups inside the country that are not in power currently, they have incentives to tell you whatever you want to hear, as long as you're willing to put them in power. So often the United States will look to these groups to say, can you just tell us kind of what's going on inside the country, provide us the information we need, and then we'll put you in power once we overthrow the regime. And it's often the case that what they tell you is completely inaccurate, and it's just kind of self-serving in order to get what they think would be best for themselves. She looks a lot at actually the Libya regime change mission in 2011 and found that even there, they were not being truthful completely with the United States about their intentions and what they were wanting. They were trying to convince the US that to get involved in order to overthrow Gaddafi. I think in most cases, they try to paint themselves as having the full picture or having the full support of the domestic population. But going back to what I was saying earlier, if you're imposed by a foreign power, the domestic population is always going to look at you skeptically. And it's going to be hard to try to, if you took a foreign country to place you in power, do you have the domestic legitimacy necessary to stay in power? And that's kind of what they're always fighting.
Excellent. Well, I think we will we'll go ahead and wrap it up with that. Thank you, Ben, for coming out.